On a cold Tuesday morning in October 2022, a black sedan pulled up to Providence Municipal Court.
Where are the plates now?
The man who stepped out moved with the calculated precision of someone trained in executive protection, shoulders square, eyes scanning, positioning himself with clear sightlines to all exits. Michael Thompson, 61 years old, carried himself like federal law enforcement. Everything about him, the mirror-polished shoes, the perfectly pressed suit, the controlled awareness, spoke of years protecting the most important people in the world. But what he was about to reveal in Judge Frank Caprio's courtroom would expose a pain that no amount of training could prepare him for. This is the story of a man who spent 8 years ready to die for his president, only to discover that the hardest battle he would ever face was one he couldn't win. Providence Municipal Court had settled into its familiar Tuesday rhythm. Judge Frank Caprio, now 80 years old, had presided over countless traffic violations, parking disputes, and minor infractions during his 4 decades on the bench. The gallery held the usual mix of nervous drivers, frustrated commuters, and people hoping the judge's famous compassion would extend to their particular circumstances. At 9:47 a.m., when Michael Thompson walked through the courtroom doors, the energy shifted. Court reporter Margaret Walsh, who had documented Judge Caprio's cases for 22 years, made a note about the unusually composed defendant. In her experience, people facing serious charges usually showed some sign of stress, fidgeting, whispering, checking phones nervously. Michael Thompson showed none of these behaviors. He sat with the patient stillness of someone accustomed to long hours of silent vigilance. Other defendants noticed him too, though they couldn't quite articulate what made him different. "Looks like Secret Service," someone whispered. "Probably federal agent," another voice suggested quietly. The way Michael's eyes swept the room's entrances and exits, the careful positioning that gave him clear sight lines, the unconscious way he kept his hands free and ready. These were the habits of someone trained in executive protection. At 10:15 a.m., Bailiff Officer Rodriguez called the case. State of Rhode Island versus Michael Thompson. "Please, state your name for the record," Judge Caprio said, beginning the routine that had become second nature over 4 decades of judicial service. "Michael Anthony Thompson, Your Honor." His voice carried measured authority with just a trace of a Texas accent. "Mr. Thompson, according to the citation, you were traveling 52 miles per hour in a 25-mile-per-hour school zone on September 28th at approximately 3:15 p.m. How do you plead to this charge?" "Guilty, Your Honor." Michael said it without hesitation. "I was speeding, and I take full responsibility for my actions." The straightforward admission surprised gallery members who had expected someone with Michael's obvious professional background to challenge the citation or request legal representation. But Judge Caprio recognized the response of someone who accepted accountability without excuses. "Mr. Thompson, can you explain the circumstances that led to this violation?" Michael hesitated for the first time. Judge Caprio saw something flicker across his composed expression, not defiance or irritation, but something that looked like barely controlled anguish. "Your Honor, I was rushing to reach my wife at Rhode Island Hospital. I had received a call from her oncologist indicating there was a critical development in her cancer treatment that required my immediate presence." The courtroom fell silent. This wasn't a routine traffic case. This was a husband racing to be with his dying wife. Judge Caprio leaned forward. "Mr. Thompson, I sense there's more to your story than meets the eye. Your bearing suggests military or federal service. Is that correct?" Michael's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. For someone with his obvious professional training, any visible reaction suggested the situation was profoundly serious. "Yes, Your Honor. I served as personal driver and close protection officer for President George W. Bush for 8 years, from 2000 to 2008. The revelation hit the courtroom like lightning. Every person in the gallery immediately understood They were witnessing something extraordinary. George W. Bush, the 43rd president, who had led the nation through 9/11 and two wars, had been protected by the man now standing before Judge Caprio for a traffic violation. Judge Caprio's eyes widened with recognition and something approaching awe. "Mr. Thompson, when you say you served as President Bush's driver and protection officer, what exactly did that entail during those critical years?" "I was part of his personal security detail, Your Honor. I was responsible for secure transportation, route planning, and close protection during public appearances. This included Air Force One movements, foreign dignitary meetings, and high-threat situations during the September 11th attacks and subsequent military operations." The gallery absorbed this in stunned silence. Judge Caprio himself was grappling with the profound contrast between Michael's prestigious past and his current circumstances. "Mr. Thompson, serving President Bush during the post-9/11 era must have been extraordinarily demanding. Those were some of the most dangerous years for presidential security in modern history." "Yes, Your Honor. Constant threat assessments, 18-hour days, extensive travel, multiple assassination attempts that the public never knew about. It was the honor of my lifetime, but it required complete dedication. Everything else in life had to be secondary to the president's safety." Judge Caprio was beginning to understand. There was a deeper story here. "You mentioned racing to the hospital to be with your wife during a critical moment. How long has she been battling cancer?" Michael's controlled expression finally cracked slightly. "Your Honor, my wife Sarah was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer in 2009, 1 year after I left my position with President Bush. The doctor said she needed aggressive treatment and extensive family support. The timing was devastating." "Why did you leave your position with the president?" Michael was quiet for a long moment, wrestling with how much personal information to share in a public courtroom. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that had changed everything. "Your Honor, my wife had supported my career for 25 years. She had endured the long hours, the constant travel, the security restrictions that prevented me from discussing my work. When she was diagnosed with cancer, I realized that she had sacrificed her needs for my career advancement for decades. It was time for me to sacrifice for her." Judge Caprio felt a profound recognition. Michael Thompson had walked away from one of the most prestigious positions in federal law enforcement to care for his cancer-stricken wife. "That must have been an incredibly difficult decision, Mr. Thompson." "Yes, Your Honor. But Sarah was more important than my career. I could protect the President of the United States, but I couldn't protect my own wife from cancer. I realized that the only way to help her was to be present in her life consistently during her treatment." Judge Caprio understood the full scope of what he was hearing. Secret Service agents who served on presidential details typically had lucrative post-government career opportunities in private security or corporate protection. Walking away from that world to care for a cancer patient represented a level of marital dedication that was both inspiring and economically devastating. "How has your wife's condition progressed since 2009? Michael's controlled expression showed the full weight of 15 years, watching his wife battle terminal illness. "Your Honor, she's fought courageously. Multiple rounds of chemotherapy, radiation treatments, experimental therapies, clinical trials. We've had periods of remission followed by recurrence. Some years were hopeful, others were terrifying. The emotional and financial toll has been overwhelming." Judge Caprio realized he was looking at a man who had spent 15 years watching his beloved wife slowly die while struggling to afford her medical care. "Mr. Thompson, you mentioned that you were speeding to reach the hospital because of a critical development. Can you tell me more about what happened on September 28th? Michael took a deep breath. Judge Caprio could see him making the decision to share one of the most painful moments of his life with a room full of strangers. Your Honor, my wife had been participating in an experimental immunotherapy trial that we had hoped would extend her life. On September 28th, I was working my second job as a security guard at a local mall when I received a call from Dr. Richardson at Rhode Island Hospital. He paused, steadying himself. He told me that the treatment had failed and that Sarah's cancer had metastasized aggressively. He said I needed to get to the hospital immediately because they were moving her to hospice care. The courtroom was now completely silent, except for the sound of people quietly crying. Your Honor, the doctor told me that Sarah might only have days or weeks left, and that she was asking for me. After 15 years of fighting this disease together, we were facing the reality that she was going to die, and I wasn't there with her. Judge Caprio realized he was witnessing one of the cruelest ironies imaginable. Michael Thompson had spent 8 years ready to die protecting President Bush, but was helpless to save the woman he loved most. Mr. Thompson, when you received that call, what went through your mind? Terror, Your Honor. Absolute terror mixed with rage at my own helplessness. I had spent 8 years prepared to take a bullet for President Bush, but nothing in my training prepared me for the possibility that I was going to lose Sarah, and that she might die alone while I was working at a mall food court to pay for her medications. Judge Caprio was now fully invested in Michael's story, the speeding ticket completely forgotten in the face of this much larger human drama. Your Honor, I got in my car and drove as fast as I could because I knew that every minute could be the difference between being with my wife when she needed me most and missing our final conversation. I had already missed too many important moments because of work obligations. I was not going to miss the chance to tell her I loved her one last time. Judge Caprio understood that Michael Thompson represented something profound about love and sacrifice. This man had protected the leader of the free world, but his greatest battle was happening at home against an enemy that couldn't be neutralized with security protocols or tactical training. Mr. Thompson, when you arrived at the hospital, was your wife? She was alive, Your Honor. Weak and frightened, but alive. The hospice team had been preparing her for the transition, and she had been waiting for me. We were able to spend 3 days together, talking about our life, our memories, and saying goodbye properly. Judge Caprio felt tears threatening as he processed the devastating beauty of Michael's story. And your wife's current condition? She passed away on October 2nd, Your Honor. 13 days ago. The funeral was last week. The courtroom erupted in quiet sobs. Judge Caprio realized he was looking at a man who had just buried his wife of over 30 years and was now facing a traffic citation for racing to be with her during her final days. Mr. Thompson, Judge Caprio said carefully, standing up from his bench in an unprecedented gesture of respect. In 40 years on this bench, I have never encountered a case that so perfectly illustrates the difference between legal technicalities and human necessity. He walked around his bench to address Michael directly, abandoning his position of formal authority to speak to him as one human being to another. You spent 8 years ready to die for your country. You spent the next 15 years watching the woman you loved die slowly, while working multiple jobs to afford her medical care. And then, you were cited for speeding while racing to say goodbye to her before she died. Michael Thompson finally broke down completely. Weeks of held-back grief poured out in tears that represented not just the loss of his wife, but the recognition that someone understood the impossible situation he had faced. Judge Caprio waited for Michael to compose himself before continuing. Mr. Thompson, regarding the speeding violation that brought you to my courtroom, all charges are dismissed. All fines are waived. This citation is being removed from your record. The courtroom erupted in spontaneous applause, but Judge Caprio wasn't finished. Furthermore, I want you to know that your decision to prioritize your wife's final days over legal technicalities represents everything that's right about marriage and commitment. You chose love over law, presence over protocol. Judge Caprio turned toward the gallery. Ladies and gentlemen, we live in a society that claims to value marriage and family, but then creates systems that punish people for honoring those commitments when it matters most. Michael Thompson shouldn't have received a speeding ticket for racing to be with his dying wife. The applause continued as Judge Caprio made one final statement. Mr. Thompson, your service to President Bush was honorable and necessary, but your service to your wife during her 15-year battle with cancer was heroic and irreplaceable. You chose to be the kind of husband who shows up when his wife needs him most, even when it cost you everything, professionally and financially. 3 months later, Michael returned to the courthouse, not as a defendant, but to thank Judge Caprio and to share something remarkable. Using his security expertise and the small pension from his federal service, he had started a non-profit organization providing transportation services for cancer patients who couldn't afford to miss treatments. He called it Sarah's Ride, a tribute to the woman who had given him purpose, even in her absence. Judge Caprio showed me that my experience could serve a greater purpose, Michael told a reporter. I spent 8 years protecting one man. Now I'm spending my remaining years protecting the dignity of people who are fighting the same battle Sarah fought. The nonprofit quickly expanded, staffed by other former Secret Service agents and military veterans who understood the importance of mission-driven service. Within a year, Sarah's Ride was providing free transportation to over 200 cancer patients monthly across Rhode Island. Michael Thompson never remarried. When asked about it, he would simply say, "I had my great love. Not everyone gets that. I'm grateful for every moment we had." Michael Thompson's story reveals something essential about the nature of duty and devotion. For 8 years, he was trained to view threats in tactical terms, trajectories, vulnerabilities, protective formations. Every decision was calculated to keep one man safe. But cancer doesn't respect security protocols. It doesn't care about training or sacrifice. It attacks indiscriminately, and the only defense available is presence, the choice to stand beside someone you love as they face an unbeatable enemy. In walking away from his prestigious career, Michael Thompson demonstrated that true protection isn't always about preventing death. Sometimes, it's about ensuring that someone doesn't face death alone. Sometimes, it's about holding a hand through chemotherapy, maintaining hope through failed treatments, and being present for the final goodbye. Judge Frank Caprio understood this intuitively. In dismissing those charges, he wasn't just showing mercy to a grieving widower. He was affirming that our legal system, at its best, recognizes the difference between law and justice, between rules and righteousness. The speeding ticket represented a collision between two moral imperatives: the public safety regulations that protect school children, and the human imperative to be with a dying spouse. Judge Caprio recognized that Michael Thompson wasn't a reckless driver endangering lives. He was a desperate husband trying to keep a promise made 30 years earlier, in sickness and in health, until death do us part. Michael Thompson proved that true heroism isn't always about dramatic sacrifices or public recognition. Sometimes it's about the quiet choice to prioritize love over career advancement, even when it means financial hardship. Sometimes it's about working 2 jobs to afford experimental treatments. Sometimes it's about holding your wife's hand during her final days and making sure she knows she wasn't alone. He served his country by protecting the president during the most dangerous period in modern American history. But his greatest service was protecting his wife's dignity and ensuring she didn't die alone in a hospital room while he was elsewhere. That's not just heroism. That's love in its purest form. In the end, Michael Thompson understood something that his Secret Service training never taught him. The most important person to protect wasn't the one in the Oval Office. It was the one who waited for him to come home every night, who supported his dreams, who forgave his absences, and who trusted him to be there when it mattered most. He kept that promise, and in doing so, he showed us all what it really means to serve. This story reminds us that the most important protection we can provide isn't for world leaders, but for the people we promise to love in sickness and in health. Sometimes the greatest act of courage isn't taking a bullet. It's choosing to be present for every difficult moment, every failed treatment, every goodbye.